input. And just before I go to public input, members, item 12, which is the converting road reserve, unformed legal roads, pedestrian access ways to open space. You will recall this was on an agenda of 2 months ago. We referred it to a workshop. There are some questions this morning from members of this committee about the robustness of that report. At this stage, I'm just wanting to get some officer input on that. It occurred late yesterday. The questions were raised of me, and I have since raised those questions with the report writer and managers of the report writer. So I just want to possibly alert you to the possible further deferral. It's not something I like to do, especially when a report has already been on our audit paper and has been deferred and it's been subject to a workshop. But of course, we all expect the critical matters that were raised in the workshop to be addressed in the way that is expected. And there is a question about whether the matters raised were addressed as sought. But let's, I'm just alerting you to that at this time. Passing on now to public input. First up, I need to let you know that, of course, we've accepted the ones that you can see on the agenda there. I need to let you know that I've declined one request, and it was from Mr. Groban from the Auckland Electric Tramways Trust regarding the Te Wero Bridge. This matter's already been considered. We've heard from this party, and there is a process in place, a resource consent process that is, I think, just about to open for the Te Wero Bridge resource consenting. This is the new bridge being proposed by ourselves through Panuku. So I've declined that one because there is a clear and proper process elsewhere. And I have accepted the others on the agenda. So on that, let's commence with Jeff Cooper. He is the Chief Economist at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and he's bringing us the findings of his of PwC's Urban Competitiveness Project. And this material was circulated, I think, around about 3 weeks ago to members. So, Jeff Cooper, on behalf of PwC, welcome, Jeff. Could you activate the right-hand talk button?
That's on? Yeah. Okay, thanks very much for having me. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I just acknowledge my colleague Chris Rice, partner of Finance and Economics behind me as well, who's been instrumental in this research. So just by way of background, this is the first piece of research that's come out of the new PwC Cities Institute, which aims to bring together a global policy network of urban practitioners and consultants around the PwC network, take a big data and evidence-based approach using geospatial analysis, and has recently launched the PwC Public Good Research Fund to put energy into urban issues, because we think these issues are important and of national significance as well. So this is the first piece of work out of this institute. I'm going to zip through these slides pretty fast and then take what questions you have. By way of sort of high-level findings of this research, it takes a look at 11 different cities in Australasia and has a look at what has happened to discretionary income over the last 10 years. We find that New Zealand's smaller cities have closed the gap with Auckland, that Auckland is the only city of 11 to experience falling discretionary income over the decade, that the largest cities in Australasia and New Zealand, and by that I mean Melbourne and Sydney as well, have fared worst, and that overall New Zealand cities have become relatively less competitive against Australian cities. So just a high-level start here. I don't think I need to tell you this in too much detail, but obviously the last 20 or 30 years has seen a significant transition in cities around the world. 87% of New Zealand's population live in urban areas 99% of all growth is in cities. And around the world, there is a significant transition to urban areas in the order of 180,000 people every day over the next 20 to 30 years. And that obviously creates huge challenges for existing cities to deal with that. The concentration in New Zealand, what we see is that it is intensifying more. This study looks at 6 cities in New Zealand, 5, Auckland, Christchurch, Wellington, Hamilton and Tauranga. We include Queenstown as well, simply because the growth rate of Queenstown is extremely high and is a city dealing with the pointy end of growth challenges at the moment. We also look at supporting growth areas, which are areas outside of the main urban centres, and look how they are growing, because labour markets don't necessarily pay too much attention to jurisdictional domains, and we start to see population growth spilling over some of those lines that we've drawn. So why urbanisation? Urbanisation, I think this is probably a point laboured on for many years now, but it's obviously driven by higher productivity of firms that are wanting to increase concentration. They're more productive when they're together. We see this in New Zealand cities, we see it around the world. These effects look to only be increasing, and this is at the heart of many of the projects discussed around this table, I'm sure, but also something like the City Rail Link, which is trying to drive accessibility into these highly productive high concentration areas. So why compete? Why want to grow as a city? I think it's a really important question, because as the world does continue to urbanize, there is a continued fierce and fresh, I think, competition for high-skilled labor around the world. Why is that? It's because the more highly skilled people that you have in the city, the higher the higher urban wages for everybody. So a 10% increase in the supply of college graduates is associated with a 19% increase in the wages of high school dropouts and a 16% increase in the wages of high school graduates using US city data. So because of these trends, we see that the relationship between highly skilled workforces and the wages of everybody, obviously, you want to get hold of those highly skilled people. What we see in Auckland is that there has been a chronic skilled labour shortage for the best part of 40 years, and that the levels that we see now are among the highest that we've ever seen. I should say that often we just see this drop off as soon as we come across a recession. We need a better plan of attack than waiting for a recession before businesses no longer tell us that they have labour shortages. The study is very much gets to that point. One point that I want to make here when I show you these results is that for all of this, we are talking about the marginal person into Auckland. Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind. We're not talking about the average person. So when I show you these results and I show you that Auckland has not done particularly well, that is from the perspective of somebody that is looking into the city, or perhaps it is somebody, it might be one of the younger people in the city that is looking at prices as they are today, not as prices that they were 20, 30, 40 years ago, when many of us bought houses and whatnot, and face lower costs because of that. So just keep that in the back of your mind. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to have a look at discretionary income, the bottom line. And this is a methodology just where we take gross income, we try and make some assumptions around tax and take that off, and then take off transport, housing, health and education essentials to arrive at this figure. It's a methodology that forces us to consider housing and transport costs together and get to a bottom line. So the first part of the story is the income story, and what is notable about this, Auckland compared to the other 6 cities, is that Auckland's median household income has been pretty sluggish over the last couple of decades, and that we see other cities catching up, as shown there with the chart on the right. There's a whole bunch of reasons why this could be happening, and I think probably a fruitful area of research here. It could be that there's a smaller share of economic growth going to labour, falling relative productivity, could be changing demographics, right? Could be that Auckland is bringing in, because of its economic success, is bringing in people that are lower wage individuals, and that pushes the curve down. So there's a whole bunch of possible reasons behind that. In terms of basic expenditure, what we see, this is the Household Economic Survey. What we see here is that the change in expenditure for, particularly for food and transport, has risen significantly faster in Auckland than it has in other areas of New Zealand. The food component is notable there because that differs to all of the other areas that the survey looks into. The transport costs look pretty similar to the Canterbury region there as well, and that those two cities are, I think, interesting for the fact that they are spilling outwards quite a lot, that the supporting growth areas of Auckland and Canterbury are growing considerably faster than the city average. That is much more true of Christchurch than it is of Auckland, but it's still an issue here, as I'm sure committee members here know well. So, this is a big part of the story, obviously, house prices. I'm not familiar with what the bell means. Does that mean I should shoot through this
If you could maybe move through the slides a little
fast? Okay.
quicker,
Right.
that'd be good, Jeff, thanks.
Okay, so house prices here, we know they've gone up. It's the difference between Auckland and the others that make a big difference for the relative competitiveness. So look, when we put all of these things together, what does that mean? It means that Auckland has done poorly against the other 5 cities in New Zealand. On the right there, you see the difference, change in discretionary income over the last 10 years for the other 5 cities. You'll notice that all of those numbers are positive, meaning that there are gains to be had by moving out of Auckland for the marginal Aucklander. This is consistent with Aucklanders' net internal migration turning negative in Auckland, and that being enough to offset all natural births and deaths in Auckland, which means we're left with international migration. Very quickly, there's this question of who is benefiting from growth in Auckland, because whilst I'm putting information here showing that for workers and median households, things have got particularly tough in Auckland, GDP growth has been very strong. And so you get this chart on the left up here that shows that the median wage, less than 1% real growth, whilst GDP per capita 3%. That is unique to Auckland. For the rest of New Zealand, those numbers are similar. So very quickly, comparing it to Australia, point I want to make here, Perth, Brisbane and Adelaide, 3 cities that have similar growth rates to Auckland, 3 cities that are of comparable livability to Auckland, are 3 cities that have experienced very little house price growth over the last 10 years. Putting aside Sydney and Melbourne, and as a result, you get the chart on the right up there that shows that house prices for people looking to come to Auckland are obviously dramatically higher than these 3 cities. And that gets you this chart here, which just shows how discretionary income has changed over the last 10 years. In each of the 11 cities that we look at, the grey dot shows the change there per week. So for Auckland, it's a decline of about $100 per week, compared to Perth and Brisbane that are up there around $400 increase. So in terms of where the report lands here, I mean, we make 3 recommendations. This is not an Auckland report, this is a New Zealand cities report, so these things are not all relevant for Auckland, but I would sort of point to the 3rd one there. I think that is one of the recommendations that this committee and this institution could look at to understand what are the components, certainly of discretionary income, but of competitiveness that Auckland needs to work on to turn the tables on this. Because as the report mentions, if Auckland is not New Zealand's international city, there will not be one. These issues, I think, are of national importance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to PwC for actually thinking about the place of cities generally in New Zealand and specifically Auckland. And members, this small slot doesn't do this work justice really, but it's just what we've got available to us. So I thank Jeff and PwC for fitting a very big conversation into a few minutes. And clearly, I think we need to take this further, and I think it needs to at least head off to ATEED for their consideration and our own core council as well, and that we'll see that in the motion. Let's take some questions initially. Councillor Wayne Walker, please.
So I understand the emphasis around competition. Is PwC also taking things more broadly and looking at issues around sustainability, climate change, resilience, carbon accounting, energy consumption and the like? And in that setting, looking at the place of Auckland vis-a-vis other cities and locations where it might be actually desirable for those locations to have an enhancement in population?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. The answer to that is absolutely. So this is the first piece of research that's looking at cost of living. I recognise that competitiveness is much more than cost of living. There are things that you want to look at that maybe take place over a more medium term, like environmental issues, or a longer term, network effects, sectors, those sorts of things. So the next piece of work that we're looking at, which is live, work and play, is taking a much wider view of the competitiveness of cities and bringing into account many of those issues. We will be doing the same in terms of comparing it with Australian cities. They've already done research in this place, so we're going to do work which is consistent with that. And let me just say that those issues are of particular importance to me. I think they're very important for cities. It's not all about cost of growth, but for many of our cities over the last 10 years, that has been an important factor, and hence the reason we started with this report.
So does that live, work and play include sustainability in the larger context?
Certainly will, yes.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. Mayor Goff.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for that. You and I have discussed this at PwC. First of all, I just want to acknowledge your strapline that if Auckland is not New Zealand's internationally competitive city, there won't be one, because that needs to be our constant refrain to Wellington, that because, 65% of the population doesn't live in Auckland, perhaps thinks that we're big enough and ugly enough to do it all on our own. But the questions I've got are really the questions that have been raised with me by our Chief Economist, David Norman, and I would encourage the two of you to get together to discuss it. But he says that to suggest that household incomes in Auckland are $350 a week lower than in Wellington is contradicted by every LEED and household labour force data set that he has looked at. And I just want to know why that discrepancy exists, because it's a factual one.
Yeah.
And the second one is that you're suggesting that mortgage payments in Wellington have fallen, but he says that actually there's actually a significant rise in Wellington, and I just wondered if you could clear up those discrepancies. There may be an explanation for them.
Yeah, I can. So I think a lot of this comes down to the area that you're looking at, and so the first is like, why did we make the comparison that we made? So the title of the report sort of gives a hint on this. We're looking at cities, not regions. Auckland finds itself in a sort of peculiar place in this respect in New Zealand, because it's both a region and a TA, right? And so we find ourselves comparing the Auckland region to sort of smaller areas. And so that's probably where some of the numerical confusion is, that we're not looking at sort of, say, Wellington region, we're looking at Wellington city, and so the numbers are a little different. Why are we looking at TAs rather than regions? It is because we think that certainly from a city perspective, you have to do that if you want to understand cities. You can't be looking at the Bay of Plenty, and I don't think Auckland should be comparing itself to the Bay of Plenty. Hence the reason we look at cities rather than regions. I think that that spatial element is probably what's driving some of the differences that have been raised there. It's certainly the case that if we looked at a regional perspective rather than a city perspective, you might get some different results. Certainly the income numbers might push in the direction of narrowing the gap, but then the house price numbers between regions and Auckland would probably act in the opposite direction. So, I think this is a question of which is the best area to compare Auckland against, and Auckland may have reasons to think that it would prefer to compare itself against Canterbury rather than Christchurch, and Wellington region rather than Wellington. As I say, this is a report about cities, so we looked at the cities.
Okay, thank you for that. I think it is important to iron out those differences because if the situation is as dire as the report suggests, I think we'd have some real cause to worry. My second question, my last question, Mr. Chairman, is you say our GDP is going up 3%, but our income, salary and wages are only going up 1%, and you raised the question who is benefiting from growth in Auckland. I just wondered what your answer to your own question was.
Look, this report, the nature of the report is to take a high-level look at Auckland's, well, not at Auckland's, at New Zealand's ecosystem of cities, and to raise issues and areas that are worthy of further investigation and looking at the data, and I think that is one of them. We put in some reasons why that could be the case, and we've, I mentioned some of those: falling relative productivity. It could be that, for instance, we're seeing people come in from abroad that are very capital wealthy, but not necessarily wage wealthy. Those sorts of impacts could shift the dial on that. We don't land anywhere on that, and frankly, the report doesn't go into enough data to make a call on that. But there's enough there to suggest that further work should be done, particularly because the data looks so different for the rest of New Zealand. If it looked the same for the rest of New Zealand, you might say that there might be differences, there might be something wrong with the data, right? You would bring in those sorts of things, or maybe national policy would be more significant. But when you see such significant differences there between Auckland and the rest of New Zealand, that makes you think that maybe there are regional things going on.
Thank you, Mayor Goff. Councillor Clow, please.
Welcome back, Jeff. Sorry, these are vague sort of questions. Just a couple. We possibly will be considering extending the living wage, which we've targeted here and are going to reach in September. But obviously next year possibly we can look at contractors. That is a very positive thing for Auckland to be moving towards. And my second question is, why the hell is New Zealand so expensive? Go to the supermarket. We're just super expensive.
Yeah, well, and this report says that it's not necessarily all of New Zealand as well. I mean, it's concerning to me that some of the numbers, the food numbers, were so high for Auckland. I mean, what is going on in Auckland that means that those prices are high here? I can speculate. We know that land prices have doubled over the last 10 years. Land prices feed into rents feed into food, so there's a chain of logic that could be happening there. Let me just comment briefly on the living wage thing, because I think this report is of particular importance to groups perhaps that are most vulnerable in Auckland. And one of those groups is, of course, public service workers. If a firm can't afford the labour that it needs in Auckland, the firm shuts down and the firm goes somewhere else. But for a city that continues to need police, it continues to need teachers and firemen, and the cost of living has got out of control as much as it has, but the city still needs them, that's a problem for the city, right? Those people can't move because the city services need them. And so this gets at the heart that, the city needs to work for everybody. And at the moment, these sort of numbers suggest that it's certainly not working for new people that come here. And we need those people.
Councillor Hills, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I guess I did have a question on the income, because it's a bit confusing when most of the stats, apart from Wellington, say that Auckland's ahead of other areas. I guess Wellington has that public service role that might tip it up. But the other issue, or maybe just the maps sort of show in the last 10 years that obviously house prices doubled in Auckland, and that also rents went up, $350, $400 in the last 10 years. And then it kind of mirrors the discretionary income graph the opposite way. So is that sort of the main take from it, is that the housing costs increased almost the same way that a discretionary income decreased?
Yeah, so I think you're referring to this chart here, are you? It might not be in this presentation.
Yeah.
I think it was the house price going up 90, the mortgage payment and the 96% when you look at the discretionary income index going the opposite direction.
Oh, right. The answer is yes. I mean, the house price thing obviously is a big driver of discretionary income. No question about that. And when I showed the chart, this chart here on the left here, you see that since 2012, which is when the house price growth really started to kick off. Between then and 2016, that's when it went down. And so that obviously is a big driver of that change, but you do have these other two things going on there where the other regions are catching up in terms of median household income, median house, and the increase in transportation and food costs, which is a particular issue in Auckland and Christchurch, Canterbury.
And the other thing is obviously the GDP sort of matches the housing cost increase and maybe also the influx of people. But why do you think, and maybe it's not evidence-based, but why do you think people are still coming here? We're still seeing 50,000 people a year coming here. So that's obviously a pressure on all the rest, but people still want to be here for a myriad of reasons.
Right. So I think that's when the chart on the right here is interesting. So a lot of that is driven by, or almost all of it actually, when you net out natural births and deaths and net internal migration from Auckland elsewhere, you're really just left with this big international migration impact. So why are those people coming here? Firstly, I would say that those people may or may not look like the median household. It could be that they're coming in here, as I say, capital rich but wage poor. It could be that they're capital rich and wage poor and they don't look anything like the median household. They've just got more economic clout. So when house prices are rising, these people are not responding in the same way that we're seeing Aucklanders who are living here. And I think that is a very interesting observation that you see in the data. One that speaks to how much do we know about international migration? How much do we know about the economic characteristics of international migration? I don't think we probably know enough, to be honest.
Thank you.
Councillor Newman.
Good morning. I'm just retiring from a role as the chair of a school board. This year we've lost 3 trained, qualified New Zealand trade teachers, 2 to Christchurch, 1 to the Bay of Plenty. We can't get qualified and experienced New Zealand trained teachers. We're now having to do Skype interviews with candidates from the United Kingdom who have never been to New Zealand. We get applications from teachers online who have never been to New Zealand. If Auckland is to grow exponentially, and that requires more professional people working here to provide services such as teachers, nurses, trained police officers, but we're not able to pay them enough for them to be able to survive living here, what do? Because at some point we just simply run out of the qualified human capital to provide the basic services to accommodate this burgeoning population.
Yeah. So this is not a problem that's unique to Auckland. There are a number of cities around the world that have cost of living problems. The difference that we see in Auckland is that we don't have much flexibility when it comes to regional, let's say, compensation differences. So when you have a look at, let's say, the US, you see that, let's say, teachers' wages are determined at the local level. And so when you look at the differences between them across city, they're quite substantial. When you look at some of the public service compensation in the UK, there's a cost of living index that's used to help flesh that out. I mean, I think increasingly, if Auckland's cost of living is getting out of whack with the rest of New Zealand, there's a clear and obvious answer to that, and that is that we need more flexibility, regional flexibility in compensation. And I think there are numerous models around the world that you could look to for that.
It's a very difficult thing to try and look at variations to multi-member employment awards in the state sector, which are not necessarily sympathetic in this country to variations. I absolutely agree with you, but that is not where the industrial negotiation processes generally take place in the state sector. I agree that Auckland state sector employees in Auckland need to be significantly better compensated.
Yeah.
But I'm not quite sure how we can achieve that.
I mean, look, I think one way is to just show how big the differences have become. If these are a good proxy for some of those differences, they are large. They're really, really large. And I think, I take your point that that's not the direction of it. I mean, maybe it should be. I'm not involved, so I don't have to, sort of be part of those discussions. But it seems to me that if part of the argument for them is that a cost of living is the reason why we need increases, then coming at it from the angle of cost of living and using a numerical approach to that is the way to go. And that's what you see internationally.
Thank you, Councillor. Jeff, there's some very good information in here for us to digest and understand and interrogate. And while there might be a contest on some of the data sets and the evidence base, that's good too.
Yeah.
That needs to be questioned, and I'm sure PwC's up for that. But when I read this at face value, I think we've got a long way to go. In the opening page, by contrast, Auckland had rising housing, food and transport costs coupled with sluggish income growth. It is the only Australasian city in our sample to offer lower discretionary income today than a decade ago. That concerns me. And then I look over towards a key statement from UN Habitat. Cities that do not implement policies to enhance their competitiveness risk a future of stagnation and marginalisation. So my question to you is, where are we at in terms of the policies that will actually guide us on a path to be competitive and to deliver more for the people of Auckland and the nation as international cities should be contributing? So where do we stack up in your eyes in terms of the policies that take us on that path?
Look, I think that's the right question. That is why we suggest an all-of-government economic competitiveness agenda for Auckland. It is clear that there's not a single policy that is going to change the dial on this, but it is a set of policies that need to be implemented. I think there are policies that I also think that is across jurisdictions, and I made this, or I should say, Mr. Mayor made this point to me, that these levers are not all controlled by Auckland Council, absolutely. And that part of this is having a government which is sympathetic to the difference between its international city and the challenges that an international city faces with respect to huge international migration coming in and dealing with crowding and congestion and these sorts of things, and why those things are different. We need more flexibility in that, and we need an acknowledgement at the national level that these are not just differences of degree, but differences in kind. And we've, I think, had good discussions around that. But looking at these issues from a competitiveness framework is going to be important for Auckland's continued economic success. What policies would you look at within an agenda like that? I think, that would be transport stuff. It would be stuff related to zoning. It would be human capital strategies, talent, resource, automation. How are we dealing with those? Because they're more important for Auckland than they are elsewhere. And that's what we're seeing internationally for cities, that big international cities have to deal with some of these. The smaller ones do not. Where this fits into the New Zealand ecosystem of cities as well. I firmly believe that if Auckland is doing well, New Zealand is doing well, and an economic competitiveness agenda needs to make that case and make it clear, and make the case for why you would want to grow as well. So I think there's a lot of stuff that would go under the lid of an economic competitiveness agenda, and I think it speaks to the heart of what Auckland's trying to do.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, PwC. There's no further questions. Good inquiry, brief as it has been. I think we need to take this on. Members, I'm suggesting this gets directed towards ATEED. There have been some discussions between our staff and ATEED already with Jeff, and there's a a real willingness there to pick this report up from PwC. So the motion's on the screen there. I do want to acknowledge PwC for this body of work and thinking about the cities of New Zealand and the city of Auckland. This work has, in some ways, no client, but 4.7 million clients. So thank you very much. I wish you well also with your discussions with the government. I've long thought that, a government really needs to look at its ministerial posting of, or position of a Minister of Cities. Not just a Minister of Auckland, but a Minister of Cities. Hopefully that comes on their agenda shortly too. Have the motion there. Would somebody like to move? Councillor Clow and Deputy Mayor seconding. I'll put that motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Thank you, Jeff.